I'm Adam Ondra. Welcome to Factor 2.
When Adam climbed the Dawn Wall on El Capitan in 2016, I couldn't take my eyes off it. I was a teacher at the time, and every morning when my form group came in, I'd have Adam's Instagram feed on the board. We looked at the New York Times topo, we talked tactics, and we watched videos of Tommy Caldwell and Kevin Jorgensen on the first ascent. I was trying to convey to them that, for me, this is Mo Farah on Super Saturday. This was the 2-goal swing for Man City on the last day of the season. A few of them got it, and after a while they were coming in saying, "Sir, he's made it to Wino Tower. He's done it." This story isn't about Adam Ondra, but it is about a 24-year-old climber who did something incredible on El Capitan. But in 1984, Big Brother wasn't watching.
Sir Duncan is what we called him. You have a name like Duncan Critchley, and Yosemite end up with Sir Duncan Critchley. He was like the little mini Ernest Shackleton of Yosemite.
I'm Duncan Critchley. I'm a rock climber, a parent, a physiotherapist, a pain researcher, not necessarily in that order, and was a very, very enthusiastic semi-full-time climber in the early through to the mid-80s.
Certain parts of this story started to sound a little bit far-fetched to me. Duncan gets credits in the history of Yosemite climbing, not least a mention in Alex Honnold's book Alone on the Wall. But I couldn't find anything contemporary. When I asked Duncan about this, he said it just didn't occur to him to tell anybody. So I thought I'd better find some witnesses. This is Charles Cole. Charles has made more than 1,000 first ascents in California, including new routes on El Cap. Closer to home, you might have used some of his products. Charles is the inventor of Stealth Rubber and the founder of 510.
He gave us all something to hold on to for the rest of our lives. And that was what I used at 510. I tried to tell, and again, I don't know if I did a great job, but in telling the story. But yes, I always use Duncan. You be like Duncan Critchley, Sir Duncan Critchley.
The other voice you'll hear is John Middendorf. John started his own company, A5 Adventures, selling portaledges he'd designed himself. They eventually became part of the Black Diamond range, and John went on to use his designs on first ascents in Yosemite, but also on the Great Trango Tower in Pakistan.
My Bible was a book called Yosemite Climber, which is a picture book, a coffee table book. One of the first climbing coffee table books, only aimed at climbers, and it was one of the things that really sold Yosemite to me and many other people of my era. Climbing photography in the 70s was mostly fairly mediocre. The writing, if you look back through the magazines, the writing is often very good. But the photography is if you look at something like hard rock, the writing is often really excellent. But if you look objectively at the photography, it's not that great. But Yosemite Climber was, I felt, an order of magnitudes better than what was coming from sort of UK sources in the main. Nowadays, we're living in a tremendously sort of visual world. We're bombarded with images. Perhaps the writing around climbing is not as persuasive, but boy, is the sort of visual content absolutely fantastic. So Yosemite Climber, which was beautiful and full colour and tremendously inspiring, really came into a kind of a grey UK world as a sort of blast. It portrayed the short free routes, it portrayed the long aid routes, and it had an article about climbing the nose in a day.
You're listening to Factor 2 from UK Climbing. This is episode 2, 9.5 hours. Climbing the nose must be a dream for so many climbers. Climbing the nose in a day? Not so many. The first ascent of the nose in 1958 was made by a team led by Warren Harding. They spent 45 days on the face spread over 18 months. The second ascent took a week. And most climbers these days take between 3 and 5 days to climb the 31 pitches to the top.
My name is John Middendorf. I worked on rescue team from 1984 to 1990 approximately. And of course, back then, doing the nose in the day wasn't really on everybody's radar. It'd been done by Bridwell and his team, of course, about 5 years earlier, but really hadn't been done that much.
We knew of two teams that had done the nose in a day, and one kind of quasi ascent. So the first team was the Bridwell Long Billy Westway team who did the route in 1975. That was an incredible ascent. It was pre-Friends, camming devices. So they were climbing the route using a few hexes, but mainly pitons. Just unbelievable to do that in a day.
They actually climbed it quicker than Duncan says, just 15 hours. In 1978, Wild Country released the first version of Friends, designed by Ray Jardine, and it revolutionised climbing in the valley.
Back in those days, life was easy. We'd just go to the meadow every day and see who's on El Cap and take out our binoculars or our telescopes, and we'd have a picnic in the meadow. And that's where you meet all the top guys. I remember Ray Jardine. I met him there. He was selling Friends for the very first ones. I think it was 10 or 12 bucks a piece.
Yeah.
And they were magic. We couldn't even believe those things.
Yosemite wasn't Duncan's first taste of big routes. He'd been benighted twice in the Verdon previously, and his first trip to the valley wasn't without incident.
I had a great first trip. We did Half Dome in a kind of alpine style. The nose in a classic 2.5 day 2 bivvy style. Got quite wet on the second bivvy, but managed to climb out through the clouds, and that was just a fantastic experience. I was completely hooked by being up on the granite walls. After that, just sort of sitting there with your smelly t-shirt and tracksuit trousers as the sun goes down and the rock turns from sort of golden yellow through to pink, through to grey, and it gets dark, and it's just such a fantastic place. Yosemite was everything I wanted it to be. And then the last route that we did was as a result of Separate Reality, which is this big roof, a 20-foot long roof with a hand crack running out, and it had been the cover of Mountain magazine, a very famous picture with Ray Jardine, the inventor of Friends, on it. And this is one of these images that had really sold Yosemite to us. But my friend sprained his ankle on the route, taking a fall, getting the gear out of it, actually cleaning the gear, which meant that he couldn't crack climb. But he could stand in Adas with his foot flat. So we thought, well, we've done the long free routes, we've done things like the nose and Half Dome. Why don't we try one of these sort of big wall aid routes? And a friend of ours had done the first British ascent of Zodiac, so Zodiac it was. So we set off up Zodiac end of October, early November, and it was hard. It was a challenging route at the time. This sea of granite, smooth golden rock all around you, and it's extremely steep. So the whole bag is sort of floating out into space after every pitch, and it was everything that the magazine photos said it was going to be. We had a real epic on it because we got caught in a storm on Peanut Ledge, which is 3 pitches below the top, and eventually got to the top. We had to be helicoptered off, but it didn't put us off because it had been this absolutely tremendous adventure. And if people do Zodiac, it is the sort of the classic Yosemite big wall. So that kind of got me hooked on the sort of big wall aid climbing star routes.
Despite this rescue, Duncan had had what most climbers would consider to be a pretty successful trip, a relatively fast ascent of the nose already, and an ascent of Half Dome. He returned for a second time, with definite objective, but the nose in a day was still in the background.
I went to Yosemite with 4 routes sort of in my mind. I wanted to do Astroman, the west face of El Cap, Mescalito, and the Pio Wall. And by the end of the 2.5 months, we'd done all the routes. Came back to the UK. I'd spent sort of 9 months in the States, and I was a bit of a lost soul in terms of what I wanted to do. You know, I hadn't finished my degree at Sheffield, so I spent time working in climbing shops, the usual sort of thing. And I'd met some friends in Yosemite who'd said, come out to Australia sometime. You know, the climbing there is absolutely fantastic. Weather is great. Work is available. You have a great time. But I took up the offer and went off to Australia. Arapiles at that time had a climbing community of maybe half a dozen people. So there were mostly Australian, some New Zealand climbers signing on the dole and perhaps working casually, picking fruit. Camping was free. Food was extraordinarily cheap, and you could live on next to nothing. So that's what I did. Arapiles is a magnificent place to climb. You know, the rock is wonderful to climb on. It's a combination of the best parts of gritstone and limestone. If you've not experienced it, it's beautifully coloured. The problem, though, with the scene there, as I say, is there were very, very few people. There were full-timers, and like full-timers in any part of the world, they'd done nearly everything that they needed to do or wanted to do. Getting them sort of motivated to go climbing was sometimes a bit of a challenge. Getting them to get out of bed before 2:00 in the afternoon was sometimes a bit of a challenge. And I wanted to climb, so this was all terribly frustrating. As a result of that, I started soloing. I really, really enjoyed the free soloing there, you know, the sense of liberty, the sense of just moving over rock. John Backer, the great American climber, talked about having a Half Dome day or an El Cap day soloing, where he would go off and solo 20 pitches or 30 pitches. I didn't have to wait for people to get up in the morning, so I could go off and I could have a Half Dome day. I consciously was doing this. I was going off and trying to solo the equivalent of Half Dome or of El Cap. I'd had no idea about training or how to kind of prepare myself, really. Instinctively, it felt like climbing in the nose in a day meant you had to climb 3,000 feet worth of rock. What was a good preparation for doing that? Well, I would go off and climb 3,000 feet of rock. I kind of had that in the back of my mind when I was soloing around Mount Arapiles as well. This large amount of sort of free soloing was something that was kind of driven by necessity, but it turned out to be, you know, fantastic training for what came next.
Well, we don't know who he is. He just shows up. In those days in Yosemite, when people arrived in Camp 4, if you've already been living in Camp 4, you kind of know all the visitors. There just weren't that many people, and you'd see them, and you'd say, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" Or in his case, what are you doing? And we were all interested in walls. Anybody's interested in a wall, they stand out. First of all, they have a ton of gear. They lay it all out in their camp site to get ready for the wall, and you just walk up to them and say, "What wall are you planning on?" Everybody in Camp 4 knew who was on what wall at any given time. You know, he can do this stuff. And it was one of these people I'd never heard of him before, and I don't know anybody in Yosemite, at least in my crowd, that had heard of him. And he came, and he did it, and we went, "Wow, who is this guy?" So we were watching quite intently.
Well, I'd met Duncan in Camp 4, and I'd always been interested in any sort of overseas climbing, so I picked his brain about the British UK climbing scene. But then one day I was just walking through the Yosemite Lodge parking lot after doing a bit of bouldering there, my climbing for the day, and I saw Duncan, and I asked him what he'd been up to. He told me he'd just come down from the nose, and I said, that's odd, because I'd just seen him the day before. He was walking around the parking lot having just climbed the biggest rock face in Yosemite.
Turned up in Yosemite on my own this time, so very much relying on people that I met from the Camp 4 notice boards or just who happened to be sharing the campsite with me. And I climbed Astroman a second time with a guy called Mark Rollofson. I'd done Astroman before, but Mark wanted to do it, and I was very keen to lead the pitches, which I hadn't done the previous time. We took about 5.5 hours on it, which was quite an efficient ascent that seemed to kind of attract people's attention. But after Astroman, I was approached by a guy in the Camp 4 parking lot, which is where a lot of good adventures start. I was being headhunted. It's not a term I was familiar with, or even an idea I was familiar with at the time. Thinking back on it, that was what was happening. And this guy, tall, looked like the archetypal Brit climber of the time. Scruffy jeans, fleece jacket, which is practically falling off his shoulders. And he was Swiss. I thought, this can't be right. Swiss climbers are supposed to be, immaculate, coiffured guides. And he looks like someone that ought to be dossing in the stony woodshed. This was Roman Vogler. And the name was familiar. I was a big consumer of climbing media, which means climbing magazines. And I thought I'd heard of the name. And yeah, so he was the guy that had been doing new routes on the Grand Cap in Chamonix. And after about 30 seconds of kind of small talk, he said, do you want to do the nose in a day? And I thought, yes, I certainly do.
There were some climbers, like Roman was one, I'd say, and he really didn't, I think he was well known, but not really well known in Yosemite. And frankly, there's some climbers who came in and didn't really want to integrate with the whole community that was there. And I think Roman was one of those, because I never got to know him at all. I think he just kept to himself and cherry-picked his partners, like with Duncan.
And it struck me that this was the perfect guy. Someone who was used to climbing in the Alps, used to getting a move on. What was entertaining, though, was that he saw me as being the aid climbing half of the partnership. Despite being a Swiss alpinist and me being a kind of a purist Brit rock climber, he thought he'd be doing the free climbing and I'd be doing the aid climbing. Well, I wasn't quite so sure about that, but we smoothed out. Diplomatic relations were kind of established pretty quickly. Roman was one of those people that when you meet them, you get a really strong, instinctive, positive feeling about them. I just knew immediately that we were going to make a great team. He had the sort of the balance of enthusiasm and drive and the kind of the inner steel, but he was great fun and laid back at the same time, but not too laid back. He'd have been equally as frustrated in Mount Arapiles, I think, as I had been. This was perfect. I'd found my partner without even having to look for him. At that point, we thought, well, we probably ought to do a warm-up route together. That would be the sensible thing. What haven't we climbed? And we kind of went through, south face of Washington Column, north face of Half Dome. There were various possibilities, but we'd done them all. We couldn't think of routes that we hadn't done. So we thought, oh, what the hell, we'll just go for it. And we decided that 21st of June would be an auspicious day to do the nose. I'd assumed that we might be actually sort of fixing some of the pitches up to sickle. So we decided that we would set out at first light. We took Danish pastries as our performance fuel for the day, and climbed it in tracksuit trousers and t-shirts. I can remember just jumping for a piece of tat on one of the first 4 pitches, and thinking this is the style. And then we got over into the stove legs and started simul climbing up it. 5'8", 5'9", hand jamming. I'm not sure I would do it now, but it felt totally secure and the logical thing to do at the time. I just wanted to get up the thing and not get benighted. I just did not want to spend another cold night on a stone ledge somewhere. If we could get up the route in a day, I would be totally happy. I had no goals in terms of trying to beat times. Anyway, we met up the evening before and sort of talked about strategy, and we both agreed that moving together would be the way to go. Being European climbers, we went with a double rope option. It was not the best idea, but the mental barrier of climbing El Cap in a day, because it is just huge. Sit in El Cap meadows or drive along the road there. It really, really is enormous. And the idea of climbing in a day is it was a big mental barrier. So we simul climbed up the stove legs, and then the section from Dolt Tower to El Cap Tower, which, as I say, is about 15 pitches. It's about 1,400 feet of climbing. And we'd set off at, just as it was getting light, bang on 5 a.m. We reached El Cap Tower at about just a little bit after 8 in the morning. The route was relatively clear. Even in 1981, there were issues with congestion on the route. It was popular even then. There was one team up high on the route who weren't going to get in our way, and there was another team who were bivvying on El Cap Towers, which is 15 pitches up. Romain knew them, and he said, they're fine, they're going for a casual 3-day ascent, they'll let us through, won't get in our way, no problem at all. And the guys, Romain's friends, were still in their sleeping bags. So we kind of rocked up there, and they said, where have you come from today? Oh, we just started out. Oh. I think at that point we realised we were going to do the route in a day. And I certainly relaxed. And after that, we just pitched the route out. We didn't simul climb, other than perhaps a few short sections. So we were just treating it like a big crag. Really intense memories of doing the thing was we're sitting at the end of the Great Roof Pitch. This is something that's involved a bit of aid. So Romain had probably asked me to lead that pitch, and I was belaying him up the pitch, and sat there. This is a point where the exposure really kicks in. A lot of the nose doesn't feel that exposed. It's either a little bit slabby or it's within the corner features. The Great Roof Pitch is somewhere where you really all of a sudden realise you're 2,000 feet up above the valley floor. And I was sat there in my tracksuit trousers and t-shirt like I was doing a 2 or 3 pitch route on Gogarth or something like that. And it just felt absolutely amazing. Treating El Cap like a giant crag. It was so cool. Romain led most of the top dihedral as I remember it, and we topped out, and I can remember his words as I reached the tree. Shall we have a naughty look at the watch? and it was 2:30, so we'd taken around 9.5 hours on the route. He wasn't a man for hanging around, the Alpine guide side of him was very much sort of ingrained, and he absolutely shot off down the East Ledges descent, and we were back in Camp 4 by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I remember walking back into Camp 4, bumping into John Middendorf, and he said, "What have you been up to today, Duncan?" "We've just climbed El Cap."
I think I was having a rest day essentially, but I'd just been bouldering a little bit, and I was walking through the Yosemite Lodge parking lot, and I see Duncan, and I said, "Hey, Duncan, how's it going?" And just checking in, what you been up to today? And he told me he just, and I think he was pretty casual about it too, maybe affectedly so, but he was just like, "Oh yeah, we just, me and Roman just climbed the nose," and I was like, it's one of those times when you just do a little double take, like. You actually started today, and you are back down right now.
So that was the first and sadly the last route that I ever did with him, and it astonishes me now really that we had the confidence in each other to go off and start simul climbing together. And looking back at it seems like a really stupid thing to do. But at the time, it just felt so right and so natural, and I had such confidence in the guy that it just seemed like the completely appropriate thing. And unfortunately, I never managed to climb with him again because he had an abseiling accident and died in the early 90s, and I did very, very little climbing from 1984 through to the kind of the early mid-90s, and so never had a sort of chance to even to meet up with him again. It's one of the holes really in my life, I think. But we had a hell of a day together.
You've been listening to Factor 2 from UK Climbing. Duncan and Roman's ascent is credited as the third in-a-day ascent of the Nose. Several other teams did the Nose in a day during the 80s, but their record stood until 1990. For Duncan, the record wasn't important. This was just a big day at the crag. It might seem bizarre, but this is just the first part of the story. After climbing the Nose, Duncan went on to do something that sealed him into the hearts of those in the valley at the time. Join me next time for episode 3, Alone, Off the Wall.
What do you do after you do the Nose in a day? Well, what about doing the Nose and Half Dome in a day? That would be cool, wouldn't it? Wild plans about, paraponting off the top of Half Dome, and I'll tell the 510 story.
Just in what he did, he really changed the story of Yosemite climbers for the better. He set a standard during that descent that everyone I know tried to follow. And I sure wish people knew more about that today. And we all said that eventually. Duncan Critchley set the standard. And we all tried to live up to that standard after that.